So thanks for coming, first of all, to everyone. My talk today is on a paper which is co-authored by three fantastic students, Otso, who graduated last year, and Hannah and Sam, who are literally finishing up as we speak, and I think are on here as well. So the motivation for this paper was to look more closely at why there is such a lack of diversity in the economics profession. And something that has been discussed, obviously, a lot in the news in recent months. Alongside that, in the past few years, in England, there's been a discussion about why it seems like BAME students, so non-white students, seem to be less likely to graduate with first-class degrees, so top marks, which are obviously a requirement to get into the top graduate programs, and doesn't hurt to have those grades if you're going straight into the job market as well. So I'm going to start the discussion by looking more closely at how grades vary by gender and ethnicity, then at what the median economics student looks like, and how this can be linked to the gaps in the grades that we observe. And then finally, policy implications of these findings. So this is an empirical exercise using detailed data from a single academically selective university, but we think the picture is not that different in other elite universities. We're only considering UK domicile students for two main reasons. First, we have more detailed data on them. On socioeconomic status, for example, but also we can then sort of control for things like language differences. So just to note, I will be using this word BAME fairly often, because this is a standard category here in England. It stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic. And in just a minute, I will comment on the different ethnicities in there as well. And then finally, just to note that in the UK, when students apply for university, they apply for a major. So everyone we're speaking about here is studying for an econ degree. So how do marks vary by ethnicity and gender? So the first thing to note here is that the orange bars indicate the proportion of females who get first-class degrees, the top marks. Blue is for the males. And you can see that there's a gender gap in econ. What we've done is to show a bunch of different programs who all have equally high entry requirements. So it's almost like we're conditioning on high school grades to a certain extent. And you see even amongst those very selective programs, econ has a gender gap, and in some of those programs, women actually do well. But the difference for econ looks even bigger if you compare white males to everyone else. So here, the blue bars are white males, orange is everyone else. And you can see here that there's a big difference, and it's not surprising at all that the profession is so white and male if those people are much more likely than anyone else to get the good grades, go on to the top grad schools, and so on and so forth. So let's move on to looking at the characteristics of econ students, or the makeup of the econ classroom, just to see what we can uncover about the causes of these differences in grades that we observe. So what does the econ classroom look like? Well, we know, and our data shows that it's predominantly male, though that gap is smaller for BAME non-white students. If you now drill down into the individual ethnicities, this is where you see that most of the diversity is coming from Asian students, and because this is Britain, this is largely South Asian students. And it's noteworthy that there are very few Black students. So that means that, obviously breaking apart and looking at the ethnicities that are in that BAME category is a no-brainer, and also means that pretty much everything I'll be talking about here will be driven by the Asian students. So the final characteristic I'll talk about is socioeconomic status. So let's start with POLAR, which is a local area-wide index of deprivation, which is widely used here in England, and shows the quintiles of POLAR. So that blue bar shows you the top quintile. So it's showing that econ students, more than 60% of them come from the 20% most privileged areas. So one may say that this level of privilege is because econ is so selective academically. So what we did was we looked at similar programs. So again, the same high levels of entry requirements, and tried to compare that with econ. So if we start at the bottom there with the polar quintiles, what you see is that the bottom quintile doesn't actually look that different for econ. But if you look at the top quintile, so the fifth quintile, that's where you see that econ is more skewed. If you go up a little bit to look at ethnicity, you see that econ's much less likely to have Black students. And then if you go on further to look at secondary school type, this is really interesting because more than 90% of kids in this country go to state-funded schools. That's the first row in that category. Econ actually looks quite good here. So we have 41% of our students coming from state-funded schools. But that good news is a little bit misleading. Our data set is actually really unique because we know what exact schools students come from. So we can map this to various school characteristics from the government's Department of Education. So we've done this in this next table. The yellow highlights are things that are statistically different from econ, which is the top row. So you can see that econ's quite different at the bottom end of the income distribution, which is the first set of columns, so the percentage disadvantaged. And it's quite different at the top end of the income distribution, which is the second set of columns, which is percentage going on to the best universities. The last point to note here, and again, we're comparing with programs which are equally selective. Last point to note here is that at the bottom here, we show the UK average for private or independent schools, the schools that the most privileged go to. If you look at the number for the percentage going on to the best universities, econ looks bad, even compared to those guys. Okay, so the final part of this analysis is a Oaxaca blinder decomposition. So this is a very standard technique in labor economics. So we're trying to figure out this gap that we've observed in the grades. How much of it is due to the different characteristics that we've just been talking about. So this graph shows you the results of our decomposition. And this is for the overall degree. So if you look at all the years of the degree, overall, the result that you end up with, your final GPA, for example, how much of that is, how much of the gap in that between BAME students and white students is because of the different characteristics that we just talked about. So first thing to note here is that the yellow bars tell you the amount of the difference that's explained by the different characteristics that we talked about. And the green bars, the total difference. So about half of the total difference is explained by the characteristics that we've talked about. You can see that polar is the one that explains most of that explained difference. And if you add that to the school quality variables that we just talked about, so general sort of putting all the socioeconomic status variables together, that's most of where the difference is coming from. But the pink bar is showing you how much of the difference is unexplained, and that's pretty big as well. So these could be variables that we just don't have in our data set that are maybe truly unobserved. It could be things like match quality, so the quality of the match between the individual and the program of the university. But it could, of course, be discrimination in the classroom. And we've all heard, I think, in the last few weeks, a lot of anecdotes about this. So the final thing that we did was, because we had detailed information about the individual courses in each year of study for all of these students, we wanted to look at where this difference, the gap in grades, is coming from that we see in the overall grade. And we looked at required courses for the econ major versus optional courses for two reasons. A, the required stuff is fundamental. And then B, we wanted to see whether white students were strategically, systematically taking different courses. The answer to that is no. Most of the gap is coming from the required courses. So sort of any amount of strategizing on course choice isn't going to help. Very little of the gap in the first year required courses can actually be explained. And the amount of the gap in the second year that can be explained is, again, socioeconomic status, but bulk of it is unexplained. So what did we find? What we found that there are very few Black students and students from disadvantaged backgrounds, which says that there's a need to find out why and what we can do about this in relation to recruitment strategies. perhaps more importantly, once these students are here, we need to think about retention strategies, which brings us to that second point, which is about the gap in compulsory courses. The sort of cheap win is to provide resources, targeted resources for learning support. But then perhaps we also need to step back and review more fundamentally the content, teaching, and assessment methods in these courses. And finally, just to end up, if you're looking at these results, if you know these results and you do admissions for a top graduate program, perhaps you should also be looking to evaluate or interpret sort of undergrad grades in a different way, giving this information in your admissions process. All right, I think I'm just over time. Sorry, Brendan. So thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions in the Q&A, in the chat, or you can get in touch with me via email or Twitter.